Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and welcome to my Topaz guide and review. By the end of it, you're gonna know exactly how good she is, and everything there is to know on how to play and build her. We'll be covering her power and place in the meta, kit and gameplay, best builds, and team synergies. Topaz is a fire, hunt, summoner character that excels at supporting follow-up attack teams. She debuffs an enemy, causing them to take way more damage from any follow-up attack, while doing respectable follow-up damage of her own, thanks to her partner Nami, who works similar to Jingyuan's Lightning Lord. As a blend of support and DPS, her damage at E0 won't compete with top DPS like Jingliu or Ambivalune, but she definitely packs a punch. To understand her power, let's cover her main strengths and weaknesses. Topaz's biggest strength is her skill that marks a target applying a 50% damage taken increase to follow-up attacks. This multiplier is separate to most others and will almost always be in full effect, giving you straight up 1.5 times damage to those attacks. On top of this, her signature Lightcone increases the entire team's critical strike damage against the target by 24%. With these combined, follow-up attackers that target Topaz's mark gain roughly 60% more damage, which is on the power level of most Nihility characters like Pella or Silver Wolf. On top of this, Topaz and Nami do good break and damage, with both of those scaling the more follow-up attackers you have on your team. Topaz also has two viable rotations, a skill point neutral one that allows her to do maximum damage, and a skill point positive one that deals 15 to 20% less damage but is more supportive. Using one or the other or swapping between them is incredible for teams tight on skill point. Topaz's biggest weakness is her pure single target kit, limiting most of her damage and debuffs to the one target marked by her skill. In fights with multiple enemies, playing around this mark mechanic can definitely interrupt the flow of the fight. But this weakness can be easily solved by pairing her with an AoE follow-up attacker like Jingyuan or Clara that takes out the trash, leaving only the big guys left. Thanks to her kit, Topaz gains massive damage when paired with follow-up attackers that hit frequently, and her debuffs mostly work on follow-ups too. So if your account doesn't have follow-up units, you'll be missing out big time on a lot of what she has to offer. So with Topaz's main strengths and weaknesses covered, where does she stand in the meta? Well, Topaz is a strong contender in dual damage compositions, supporting another follow-up attacker in a Nihility style role, while also bringing an abundance of damage herself. She is capable of enabling skill point unfriendly supports like E4 Permaspeed Asta and Fushuan to operate at maximum efficiency. But she can also be played as a hyper carry, but keep in mind as a pure single target, her clear speeds in AoE fights will be slower than top meta picks. With the release of more follow-up attackers and gear sets, her potential to deal top tier damage could rise substantially. Her rare damage debuff also will likely only grow more powerful in the future. Overall, pulling Topaz if you already have powerful invested follow-up attackers will provide you many new team possibilities and great future potential. So let's dive into how to push Topaz's kit and gear to the limit. When playing Topaz, your main job is to ensure the highest priority elite enemy on the field always has Proof of Debt on them. Using Topaz's skill applies Proof of Debt to a target, and commands her pet Nami to attack, dealing decent damage. Proof of Debt is a special debuff mark that applies the 50% damage taken increase for follow-up attacks we mentioned earlier, and you can only have one of them. The mark is hard to miss and looks like this in game. If no enemies have Proof of Debt on them, it'll be randomly applied to one on the very next ally action. But usually it's not the enemy you want. So use the skill to move it to the highest single target threat as soon as possible. Topaz's skill is special and counts as being both a follow-up and skill attack and gains all effects from being both, including damage bonuses. The damage from this skill is also considered an attack from her pet Nami, which will be relevant soon. Thanks to her bonus ability Overdraft, her basic attack is also considered both a basic and follow-up attack, which is super important for her talent. Topaz's talent summons Nami at the start of battle, who inherits all of her stats except speed. Nami moves independently of Topaz at a speed of 80, which is definitely on the slower side of things. On Nami's action, they launch a follow-up attack at whichever target is marked with Proof of Debt. To make up for Nami's slow speed, when the enemy marked with Proof of Debt is attacked by any follow-up except Nami's own, Nami's action is advanced forward by 50%. You can observe this on the action order by watching Nami jump up the queue. Each advance is equal to 62 action value. So if your Nummy's action number has 62 or less in the turn order, advancing them will make them move next. By exploiting this effect and spamming follow-up attacks on the marked target, you can make Nummy go absolutely crazy and hugely boost Topaz's damage on the team. To take full advantage of her talent, building teams with follow-up attackers and ensuring the marked target is always the focus is critical. Always aim at the marked target with Topaz's basics because they count as follow-ups, and any other follow-up mechanic as well, and move it with the skill as needed. Topaz's ultimate empowers Nummy for their next 2 attacks, increasing their base damage and crit damage massively. You can see how many empowered attacks Nummy has left here. While Nummy is empowered, any attack, not just follow-ups that hit the marked target, will advance Nummy by 50%. This effect is incredibly powerful and allows even non-follow-up attackers to boost Nummy's speed. To get the most out of this ultimate, your goal is to trigger the generic team-wide 50% advance as many times as possible, to get as many free advances as you can. To do this, always time the ultimate for right after Nummy moves for maximum value. But remember from earlier that Topaz's skill counts as Nummy attacking, and will immediately consume a charge of the ultimate, limiting your chances at getting free advances. For this reason, while the ultimate is active, avoid using Topaz's skill. Finally, thanks to one of Topaz's bonus abilities, empowered Nummy attacks also generate an additional 10 energy for her, massively improving her rotation. Topaz's technique summons Nummy in the overworld. While they're out and about, they'll track down any treasure around you and lead you to them. Also, while active, when entering battle, Nummy's first attack generates 60 additional energy for Topaz. After using the technique, Nummy will also hang around, even if you swap off Topaz, so for tough fights you should always use this technique. As a bit of extra flavor, you can also get a small amount of bonus credits for killing enemies in the overworld, up to a cap of 10,000. But hitting this cap certainly takes quite a few battles. Nummy can also find you curios in Simulated Universe, very rarely if you're lucky. To round out her kit, Topaz also deals 15% increased fire damage to enemies with fire weakness, thanks to her bonus ability Financial Turmoil. Level up Topaz's traces in the following order. Prioritize leveling both her talent and skill first and try and get them to as high a level as possible. But if you can only max one of them, the skill is the higher priority. Next, level up her ultimate and finally her basic. Whenever a bonus ability is available, unlock it, and prioritize getting the small crit rate and fire damage traces behind them. Topaz's ultimate costs 130 energy, and there are 2 different rotations to access it optimally. The skill point neutral high damage rotation uses 2 skills for 60 energy, 2 basics for 40 energy, and gains 25 energy from her ultimate, to reach a total of 125. Thankfully, we can get the last 5 we need from battle by taking damage or killing enemies. This 4-action rotation grants maximum flexibility and damage, and is my top recommendation. The skill point positive rotation, on the other hand, uses 5 basics for 100 energy and gains 25 energy from her ultimate, for the same total of 125. This rotation is more support focused, and can be good in specific teams, but sacrifices 15 to 20% damage to achieve it. Keep in mind that playing with some supports like Tingyun, or taking a lot of hits or getting a lot of kills, can let you skip actions, so keep an eye on your energy to ensure you get the most ults possible. Before we get stuck into relics, let's cover what Topaz's best stats are and why. The stats I recommend are crit rate, crit damage, and attack percentage, and to a lesser extent, damage percentage and speed. Crit rate and crit damage are Topaz's best damage scaling stats. Shoot for the standard 1% crit rate per 2% crit damage, and keep in mind that Topaz gains crit damage from her signature and her ultimate. So her crit rate can be a little lower than the normal ratio just mentioned, and still be optimal. Crit stats are the best damage increase all the way to 100% crit rate and 200% crit damage. And unless you're using very specific supports that dilute these stats, this will pretty much always be the case. Topaz has no bonuses to attack percentage in her kit, so compared to other characters, attack percentage is comparatively far more valuable to her, and only slightly behind crit damage and crit rate in value, so definitely watch out for it. Generic and elemental damage percentage isn't bad on Topaz, but she already gets a massive amount of it for free from her kit, best relic sets, and Lightcones. A standard maxed out Topaz fighting a fire weak enemy with her signature gets 92% without even using a fire damage percent orb, so getting more than this suffers from diminishing returns. Speed isn't a bad stat on Topaz, but most of her damage actually comes from Nummy, and because of Nummy's fixed speed and her ally's ability to advance Nummy's action forward, it isn't as strong as it is on other characters. Building Topaz slower and relying on allies to help her and Nami attack is a viable strategy, and the more you play into this mechanic, the less powerful speed becomes. Speed still provides damage and quality of life though, and thanks to a high base speed value, it would be a waste not to hit the standard speed breakpoints. Here are a few you can check out and which I recommend. When tackling endgame as a guideline, shoot for these unbuffed stats, including her signature's crit damage debuff if you have it. 3000 HP and 1000 defense if possible, 80 to 90% crit rate, 150 to 170 crit damage, 2200 to 2500 attack, and 134 speed. For Topaz's main set, I recommend any of the following sets: 2-piece musket and 2-piece fire, 4-piece musket, 2-piece hacker and 2-piece fire, or 4-piece fire. The combination of 2-piece musket and 2-piece fire is Topaz's best set currently, giving her the most damaging stats possible. 4-piece musket is a great alternative, granting some much needed attack percentage. The speed on this set is also nice, but only really useful when going for higher speed breakpoints or running attack percent boots, as Topaz already hits the 134 speed breakpoint just by using gold speed boots. 2-piece hacker and 2-piece fire share the same speed problems with 4-piece musket, and also grant slightly less damage. Finally, 4-piece fire, unfortunately despite being a thematic set for Topaz, isn't her best in slot, and doesn't offer her too many synergies due to how her kit functions. If a follow-up main set is released in the future, it'll almost certainly be Topaz's best in slot. So if you're a speculator, it might be worth hanging out to see if we get one. For planar sets, I recommend Inolsul Soto, Space Sealing Station, and to a lesser extent, Redolent Arena. Inolsul Soto is her best in slot and makes gearing easier thanks to the free crit rate, and there's pretty much no competition. Space Sealing Station is a good alternative though, only slightly behind in damage but makes hitting a good crit ratio much harder. Redolent Arena can be run if it's all you have with good substats. Because her skill counts as both a skill and follow-up, it's not completely wasted. For Topaz's main stats, use the following on her relics. On the body armor, crit rate or crit damage will be best, depending on your substats and which gives the best crit ratio. For boots, speed or attack is optimal, and will depend on what team you're playing with her and speed breakpoint you're after. Speed is the safest option though. For the sphere, attack percentage or fire damage percentage can be used. Which is better will depend on which supports you're using. They're similar enough though that I recommend you use the one you have the better substats for. Finally, for the rope, use attack percentage. For substat priority, crit rate and crit damage are her best substats and should be equally stacked. Attack percentage is good whenever you can get it, and speed should only be prioritized if you're going for a specific speed breakpoint for a team comp or are using attack percentage boots. When choosing Topaz's best Lightcone, we're looking for 3 things: crit stats to make building her relics easier, generic damage multipliers, and high base stats. Here, you can see a selection of her top Lightcone options, and how they stack up against each other. In first place on our chart here, we have Topaz's signature, Worrisome Blissful. It has everything she needs, and an insane team buff. It is by far her best option. It grants high base stats, crit rate, crit damage, and damage multipliers, on top of granting the entire team a 24% crit damage buff for any of them hitting Topaz's target. It beats out the competition and has 0 conditionals, downtime, or downsides. Cruising in the Stellar Sea is in second place, and is her best free-to-play Lightcone, as it has good base stats and crit rate. But this Lightcone does have a problem, and that is that a lot of its power is in conditional effects. In the comparison here, I include the attack buff with 100% uptime, and grant the life-based crit rate boost at 50% of its power. Without keeping these buffs up, it can fall behind other options, meaning skillful use of this Lightcone is needed to get the performance we show here. Swordplay is up next, and under perfect conditions does a tiny bit less damage than Cruising in the Stellar Sea. It's also harder to acquire than Cruising in the Stellar Sea, especially at S5. However, it is more generic and consistent, making it a good alternative if you have it. Swordplay provides similar damage to Cruising and is way easier to activate. It requires hitting the enemy 5 times to gain a buff, but you can instantly stack this buff with 1 Nami follow-up attack, as Nami hits 6 times per attack. Meaning Swordplay's only downside is its lower base stats and lack of crit rate, making gearing a little harder. In conclusion, her signature is absolutely the best option. Cruising at S5 is best for free to play, but the conditionals can make it inconsistent. So if you have a high superimposition swordplay, it might be a better option. The other Lightcones on this list can be used, but they do fall behind the ones already mentioned. All of Topaz's Eidolons are insanely powerful, but none are required for her to be competitive in Endgame. However, if you're looking to invest in Topaz, refer to this chart to see how much damage each Eidolon grants compared to the last. With that said, her E1 is the main Eidolon that stands out, granting in her additional debuff effect that boosts crit damage for all follow-up attacks against Topaz's target by 50%. Combining this Eidolon with her signature is a total of 75% crit damage, which is better than a free crit damage cloak for the entire team, assuming they use follow-ups. E1 is most accessible, boosts her supporting and offensive capabilities, and is the main Eidolon I'd personally consider snagging. We have a lot of freedom and options with Topaz's teams, but to save time, we'll just be covering her strongest based on my initial testing. If you want more though, I'll be testing every single team combo in an upcoming video, so watch out for that one if you want to see the exact performance of each synergy. Topaz has two main team combos, Hyper Carry and Double Damage. When constructing them, use the following templates. For Hyper Carry teams focused on maximizing Topaz's personal damage, bring Topaz in the first slot, a buffer in the second slot, a debuffer or a second buffer in the third slot, and a sustain in the fourth slot. For double damage teams that focus on follow-up attacks, good AoE, and single target, bring Topaz in the first slot, an AoE follow-up attacker in the second slot, a buffer in the third slot, and a sustain in the last slot. To understand which characters to bring in those slots though, let's cover her top character synergies. Based on current testing so far, the best buffing characters I found are Tingyun and Asta, with Bronya and Yukong coming in a bit behind. Tingyun is her best solo support thanks to her abundance of stat buffs and extra energy, both of which help Topaz immensely. Tingyun's Benediction Lightning buff also activates like crazy each time Nami attacks, boosting damage even further. Tingyun's only issue is that outside of Hyper Carry teams, you'll have to choose to either buff Topaz or your other follow-up attacker, or split the buffs in half. Asta is incredible for Hyper Carry and double DPS Topaz teams, buffing the entire team at once with huge attack and speed increases. Asta normally has big skill point issues, but thanks to Topaz's SP-friendly rotations, that's not really a problem. Asta with Eidolons is likely Topaz's most comfortable support and allows Topaz to drop speed boots while still hitting 161 speed, or alternatively reach 201 speed for insane amounts of turns. Finally, Bronya isn't bad with Topaz, but a lot of her buffs won't apply to Nami's attacks, meaning she'll likely be far more useful on a different team on your account. For the debuffer slot, I found Pella and Silver Wolf to be decent options, but notice they weren't as strong as a lot of the buffing options. Pella offers Defense Shred, which is a great damage booster, but because of Topaz's lack of stats in her kit, Pella won't be as strong as a lot of the Harmony units, especially in double damage compositions. A good option, but not the best unless you have insane gear. Silver Wolf shares the same lack of damage buffs for Topaz as Pella, but is similarly still strong if your Topaz has enough gear or can get those buffs elsewhere. Silver has the extra synergy of implanting fire weakness in enemies, enabling Topaz's fire damage trays. For the follow-up attacker slot, I found Jinyuan and Clara to be the most powerful options, but what you can use here is certainly more open to experimentation. Jinyuan's damage is all AoE, and most of it is follow-up attacks, making him an ideal partner for Topaz. Jinyuan makes fantastic use of Topaz's debuffs that empower his Lightning Lord, but he also solves her biggest issue of lack of AoE. As an additional synergy, they both work the best with the same supports, Tingyun and Asta. In the case of Asta, she can support both of them at the same time, forming one of the more competitive Topaz teams. Clara launches the most follow-up attacks of any damage dealer in the game, and deals a tremendous amount of AoE damage, making her a fantastic partner for Topaz. Most of her single target damage is also follow-up based, meaning she can take full advantage of Topaz's debuffs. Clara's only downside is gaining her ultimate fast enough to keep her damage high, taunt active, and cleave happening. For this, she not only relies on Tingyun's energy ultimate. Buffing Clara with Tingyun's ultimate is an option, but will reduce Topaz's potential damage if she got the buff instead. There are a lot of other damage dealers that have follow-up attacks that either don't trigger frequently or don't do a large amount of their damage. These characters can be played with Topaz, but aren't as synergistic as the options just mentioned. The jury is still out on exactly how effective characters like Himiko, Herder, or Blade will be with Topaz, but we'll cover that in our upcoming video. For the sustain slot, you can use any solo sustain abundance or preservation character, but I found Fushuan and Luocha to be the most powerful. Fushuan's main downside of skill points is solved by Topaz's powerful rotations. Fushuan is also a great support for Topaz teams, thanks to her team-wide crit buff, which Topaz really wants in both her possible comps. The crit rate is particularly good in the double damage comps though, as it buffs Topaz and her teammate at the same time. Luocha's main benefit of huge skill point generation isn't needed on Topaz team, but his field that heals every time any attack lands is. Nami attacks many times per turn, making teams with Topaz and Luocha close to invincible while Luocha's field is active, making him a great defensive option for Topaz team. As an honorary mention, March 7th has some of the most follow-ups of all characters in the game, and is the only accessible support with them in their kit. Unfortunately, she isn't the most comfortable character to use in her role as a solo sustainer, meaning she doesn't really fit into any traditional team comps, unless you're willing to risk running without a healer or strong shielder. But for players running double sustain, March 7th is definitely worth investigating. Based on all these synergies, my top team recommendations for now are a hypercarry team of Topaz, Tingyun, Asta, and any sustain, or a double damage follow-up team of Topaz, Clara or Genuine, Tingyun or Asta, and any sustain. Topaz is the queen of follow-up synergies, and even with our current limited roster, these were just a few of her synergies and team options. If you have any others I missed, be sure to comment them down below. Hopefully you guys learned something new and enjoyed my Topaz guide, and until next time, cheers.